Welcome, everybody. My name is Peter Loge. I'm the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs. We've got viewers online. This will live in perpetuity on the internet, so I have to do the intro, even to those of you who know me. Here in SMPA, we study, shape, and tell the stories that matter. A lot of that is politics, a lot of that's journalism, political communication. And one of the things we do is a series with Campaigns and Elections, which is a professional organization that brings together campaign professionals online, with newsletters and in conferences. 3 times a semester, we bring together a Democratic consultant, a Republican consultant, a student, and a professor, in this case me, to talk about something happening in the field of political communication. This is our, I think, 2nd year of doing it with C&E. We've covered ethics, field, the business of politics, AI, you name it. And tonight, unsurprisingly, for the last one of the semester, we're going to be talking about the elections that just were, the election that's happening as we speak. I guess the polls will close shortly after we end tonight, and then what it all means for 2026. So joining us this evening from the far end down, Mike Demkew, who is a Senior Communications and Research Director, Strategic Partners and Media Executive Director for the Republican Mayors Association. Strategic Communications, he's based in Annapolis. He has experience in campaigns and government at every level, from local elections to presidentials, including work for Governors Nikki Haley, Scott Walker, and Larry Hogan, as well as serving as Deputy Communications Director at the Republican Governors Association, where he briefly worked with SMPA alum and adjunct instructor Joanna Rodriguez, who was comms director there for a bit and is now with the Republican Senatorial Committee. Next to Mike is Chloe Emma White-Levine, the full name. She's a graduate student here in SMPA, earning her master's degree with us, looking at coalition building, social impact, and civil society. She's a graduate assistant to GW's own Professor Frank Sesno, who is the director of this program for a number of years. And she's an assistant editor at Planet Forward, which is Professor Sesno's platform for undergraduate environmental journalism. After graduating summa cum laude from Harvard in 2022 with a degree in playwriting, she spent 3 years as a digital marketing and engagement specialist for regional arts nonprofits across the country, most recently in Texas, and is back bringing that experience to politics and hoping to bring a lot of the community theater and the community activism to politics. Finally, Lucinda Gwynn, which I probably mispronounced.
Nope, you nailed it.
I feel like my night is over now. Thank you all for coming. She's a partner at Ralston Lapp Gwynn Media, Democratic media consultant. Most recently was the first Latina to serve as the executive director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Prior to that, she led large teams as the vice president of campaigns at Emily's List. She was integral in helping elect a historic number of diverse women to state legislatures, governor's mansions, and to Congress, and has been credited as the architect of 24 House pickups in 2018 that secured the House majority with women candidates. So that's the panel this evening, an august group of people. Thank you. In SMPA, it's really easy to get nonchalant about who you're surrounded with until you actually have to read their bios out loud. These are some really impressive people. This is super cool.
Happy to be here.
So I want to start with the obvious question. 2025 had some interesting elections a few weeks ago. The headlines were obviously New York, New Jersey, and Virginia, but there are other races. Mike, what jumped out at you? What are your hot takes or lessons from the most recent elections?
Yeah, look, I mean, got to admit, the Democrats had a great night. I think it's somewhat expected when you look at historical trends. When a Republican or a Democrat wins the White House, that following year, the other party does pretty well. So in this case, no different. New Jersey and Virginia, obviously, I think they're more blue states. Republicans were outraised there and outspent there. But, you know, you take a look at some other races out there. Georgia, I mean, you had 2 PSC commissioners there who were Republican seats. Democrats won those seats by about 60% of the vote they got there. You look at school board races in Pennsylvania, about 24 flipped from Democrat to Republican. Mississippi picked up 2 state Senate seats there for Democrats. So a lot going on. I think the underlying theme is that affordability was really what brought people to the polls there. Democrats' message discipline was great. You saw it with Spanberger and with Cheryl talking about electricity bills. That was huge. Mamdani, I mean, like him or not, you got to give him credit. That was the one thing he was focused on from the very beginning, is talking about affordable New York. You had Curtis Lee, we're talking about God knows what. Andrew Cuomo didn't take it very serious until the very end, I think. I think he was out to lunch, and then he realized, hey, I need to get with it. So yeah, looking towards 26, I mean, I think affordability is still going to be that one message that Republicans are really going to have to make some inroads on. President Trump ran on making the country more affordable and on immigration. And, I think it takes time. You're seeing inflation stabilize a little bit. You're seeing the price of gas, the lowest it's been since 2021. You're seeing the price of pasta go down, the price of fish go down. But still, people want to have more money in their pockets. And when it comes to your money, you're never going to be patient. You want that to happen overnight. So it's going to take some time. We have about a year to get things right there. But, lots to learn from 2025.
When it comes to your money, it's hard to be patient, I feel like is like that may be the best line I've heard in a long time. So what's your take on 25?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think I have similar takes to Mike. I think, in 2024, Republicans were very effective at really honing in on costs and making the economy and the problems in our economy Biden's problem, therefore Kamala Harris's problem. And as we are heading into 2025, this is now Trump's economy. He has had, no matter for better or for worse, right, the tariffs are his. The economy now belongs to him, and you saw that come up in every single race across the board. You saw a lot of message discipline from Mamdani's race. He's incredibly personable and charismatic, unique circumstances in that race, certainly. But then also in New Jersey and in Virginia. Virginia, kind of a state that's trending blue, but certainly has not been blue for very long and still has some pretty rural areas that are tough for Democrats. And you saw Abigail Spanberger really, bring a lot of message discipline to her campaign. And you saw the same thing in New Jersey, which is a state that's actually been trending Republican, has been leaning against Democrats for a while. And you saw Mikey Sherrill talk about, creating a state of emergency to do something about electricity costs. And you're seeing kind of more conversations about data centers and things pop up as well as we're talking about rising costs of, eggs, groceries, cars, housing. Housing comes up so much, but also electricity and utilities are a huge part of that conversation now, which you saw played in Georgia.
So 24 and 25 are both affordability elections.
They are.
So you lived 24 on the ground in Texas, and you spent the 25 elections suffering through ranting from people like me and my colleagues in SMPA. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense that affordability is top line for folks. I think in part because it's something that people have to interact with every day. I mean, there was a lot of conversation in 2024 about how pragmatic it was for Democrats to be talking about norms and ideals and democracy as opposed to, transit, infrastructure. There's these sort of two categories of issues that people can dive into, and one is the stuff that we think about and the other is the stuff that we live. And I think what all of the Democratic candidates who were successful this year did really effectively is speak to those lived experiences that we all share. I mean, Mamdani, not only was he relentless in his message, but his message was also extremely concrete. It's not just we're going to make the city more livable for people, it's we are going to freeze the rent, we are going to make buses free, right? Like everybody's getting on the bus every day. And that's why he was able to prove so effective, even with 9% of his voters being Trump voters, right? I'm not convinced that those people in the next presidential election would flip to voting for a Democrat. I think that it just speaks to the fact that people across the country are frustrated, not only with affordability, but with the breakdown of the systems that we've come to rely on in general, and somebody who can speak to that frustration with clear policies that cut through the noise of our hybrid media ecosystem are going to find electoral success.
So you raise a lot of, I think, really good and important points here, one of which is maybe affordability trumps partisanship at some level. Again, the stuff that we live. Now, Mike, you talked about affordability being really critical for President Trump. He's certainly talking about it a lot more. And you rattled off some positive economic data, which is certainly good news for those of us who buy things, right? And certainly for the president. But at some point, it runs into legislative reality, right? I mean, the CR is going to expire end of January pretty quick. Doesn't look like they've got a deal on Obamacare subsidies. Does the messaging of affordability have to match the policy, or can Republicans run and absent any sort of legislative solution? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that case, I mean, you'll have the Trump tax cuts come into play in a little bit, right? So you look at that, they're saying that you're going to save an average of $3,000 per person with that. So I think that'll be big. They'll be messaging a lot on that. In terms of other policies, I mean, I think there needs to be something that comes out of Washington. I think, the Republicans need to come up with a concrete plan when it comes to affordability. Trump talks a lot about medication prices going down. That's something that he's been hammering about lately. But, when it comes to congressional races, I think that a lot of the races that these people are going to be running don't necessarily need to be a national election, right? Focus on those local issues there. I think that's kind of what will get people over the hill in the 26 congressional races. So I think it could be two separate tracks as well.
What do you think? Does it make sense? You've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Trump and the Republicans own all three branches of government, if you will, but certainly the House, Senate, and the presidency. And, you know, watching Trump kind of back off of economic policies after solely campaigning on it, while people are still feeling the pain, I think you're seeing that reflected in the elections that we're seeing now. You have the Medicaid cuts that are coming down the pike that are also going to impact rural hospitals. That is going to impact a block of voters that have traditionally voted Republican as you see access to healthcare, physical access to healthcare really start to demolish. And then, you know, as the ACA subsidies are being ripped away and people are going to see their healthcare premiums double, maybe even triple going into next year, it is hard to make an argument that this is an affordability and an economic president that is working for everyone. And I think the referendum on that, I think, is going to be very clear as we move forward through this cycle.
Interesting. So we're going to be debating about affordability, which is probably not a bad thing as far as voters are concerned. I mean, political science research finds pretty consistently that people would rather not think about politics. They mostly want things to work.
Yeah.
And it sounds like candidates are finally catching up to the literature, which, as a former political hack who's now a professor, I'm grateful for. There is an immediate tell of whether or not this is working. There's a special election today in Georgia, in a district that Trump won by 22. Tennessee, sorry, geez Louise, Tennessee. Trump won by 22. Polling has it close. I think broad agreement the Republican is going to win, but maybe by single digits. First, is there a prediction? And two, what does the outcome tell us, if anything? What do you think? What's your prediction, Mike?
I think the Republican will win. It's not going to be by 22. I mean, it could be by 5 to 6. I think that would be good. You know, a win is a win at the end of the day. You know, you see a lot of Democrats coming out for this race. You have AOC out there campaigning with her. Al Gore's out there. That's a name you haven't heard of in a while. But no, overall, very interesting race. You see this every year, though. I mean, going back to 2010 with Scott Brown, right? That was a referendum against health care. These races are odd where they get this close. Every once in a while, you'll see a Republican get out ahead. Or the party that's not in office kind of wins it, but every once in a while, you see the other party get out ahead. But yeah, in this case, I think the Republican will win. I'm not going to buy too much into it because, like I said, you know, Scott Brown, he won that race in 2010. He got defeated pretty soundly back in 2016. So it's a one-off election, but I think the Republican will win.
So what's your hot take or prediction?
I think the story will be about the margin. I also think the Republican will win. I think a lot of Democrats are going to wake up kicking themselves for not appropriately funding that race. When we see how close the margin is, when, you know, there is a 3-seat difference inside of Congress right now, every single seat matters in how every single vote goes down. And that comes down to whether or not people are sick or taking care of family while they're in Congress and trying to vote. So those numbers really do matter, and I think we're going to have some Democrats kicking themselves. But I think the margin will be close, as we saw in the 2 Florida special elections that took place last year. Those were districts that Trump won by, I think, an even wider margin. And Democrats who had really very little national support were able to really make big gains inside of those districts as well. So I think it's telling. Maybe not for this specific district, but in how far Democrats are going to be able to take the map in 2026. You know, there are a lot of Democrats that hold seats that Trump won. The playing field is also in a lot of territory that Trump won, but not by that much of a margin. So how many more seats can we get in play, particularly in the House, where generally having more seats in play is going to be a strategic advantage to the party who's kind of playing more offense.
So if you were in class tomorrow, what would you be talking about? Are you going to echo the sentiment here that it's the Republican by single digits, we're expanding the map? Or is it just a one-off and they happen? I mean, Scott Brown's a pretty compelling counterexample here.
Well, I am going to be in class tomorrow. I'm talking about whatever happens with Professor Karp. And I mean, I agree with the prediction that both Lucinda and Mike said, that most likely Van Epps will win, most likely by single digits. And I think that the conversation we're going to have is probably the meta conversation about how the party establishments will interpret that result. And I think there's a real risk that if, you know, our prediction does come to pass, that the Democratic side will read it as too positive of a sign for next year, particularly given the underinvestment that Lucinda was talking about. I've heard many folks talking about the Georgia Public Service Commission races this past election cycle as this great sign that Georgia is suddenly going to be blue again after, sort of wavering purple to red, because both those candidates won with over 60% of the vote. But what the Democratic Party has to come to reckon with is that we've now become the party of the people who care too much, are too plugged into this stuff. The people who turn out in these special elections are much more likely to be people invested in the institutions of lowercase d democratic politics, who are more likely to support institutionalists, et cetera. And so on the one hand, I hope that Upton Bain does great as a Democratic partisan myself. On the other, I hope that we can take it with a grain of salt.
So Mike's point is the accurate one. That this is a special. It's a one-off. From a Republican perspective, look, they keep a seat in the House. Yep. Really, that's what matters when it comes to voting on stuff. The election noise will be the election noise.
Yeah.
Don't get too excited. Don't get too angry.
Well, and one of the Florida races you were talking about, I was looking at the margin earlier today, and Florida won. The shift there was 23 points to the left. Still a Republican district, and the margin is not going to be that big anytime again soon of a shift. So,
well, I want to come back to talk about Georgia again. I mean, you've now both talked about Georgia. I know Georgia. You're following some races in Georgia. This is interesting.
Yeah, I think Georgia is one of the most interesting races to take a look at. I mean, you have, all statewide offices around the ballot there, from governor, attorney general, lieutenant governor, and you have a Senate race. So that's the only Senate race in the country in a state that has an incumbent Democrat that Trump won. Right, and John Ossoff, he's done a great job fundraising. He's got $20 million in the bank since the last quarter. He's got an approval rating that's hovering around high 40s. And Georgia's a state that has moved more to the left over the last 15, 20 years. All statewide elected officials prior to those two PSC commissioners were all Republican. So it's interesting. I mean, he definitely shows he could fundraise. He's been pretty much towing the Democratic line, voted with Trump about 8% of the time. He voted to not end the government shutdown. I mean, I think that's going to be something that they'll hit him on. Who knows if it lasts? On the Republican side, I think it's an interesting primary there, too, because you have three candidates, two of which are congressmen, and one who's an outsider who has Brian Kemp's support. So you have the whole Kemp campaign behind Derek Dooley, who's the Republican outsider, former football coach. And then you have two congressmen, one, Mike Collins, who's a former truck driver. He actually won against a Trump-endorsed Republican candidate in the primary, which I think is very interesting. And the other one, Buddy Carter, who's also been a prolific fundraiser. So it's an interesting field in Georgia. With all races in Georgia, from governor to Senate, you need to get that 50% plus one. So on both sides, I mean, I think you got some bloodbaths there. For the governor's race, you have the current attorney general running, the lieutenant governor, and the secretary of state. So you have big power weights there. Democratic side for governor, you have the former mayor of Atlanta. You have a popular former state senator there, and actually the former lieutenant governor, who was a Republican under Brian Kemp. So I think just the dynamics there are really remarkable. And on top of that, you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's hovering over all of it. I don't think she'll jump into a race, but you never know. That could be something that she does. She may jump into the governor's race, the Senate race, and that just throws in a whole other curveball. So really interesting.
I would love that. That would be awesome,
That would be your dream right there, yeah, right?
Well, talk about Georgia. What's
Yeah,
your take?
no, I think Georgia's a really interesting microcosm for a lot of what we're seeing across the country, right? You just had these PSC races, so you have the economy obviously having a huge impact on people across the state of Georgia. You have a big rural component. You have a big urban component. You have voting rights and ballot security and voting security really front of mind in Georgia as court cases kind of continue from the 2020 election. And you have Raffensperger, running for the governor right now. And then you have abortion also playing out in this state. This is a state that has a heartbeat bill and it has incredibly restrictive abortion laws. And you just saw a woman who was trying to get very reasonable abortion care pass away from not being able to access reasonable abortion care. So you have this kind of microcosm of where all of these things are playing out at the same time. And I think it is important to speak to voters where they are. And to meet people where they are. And I think there is a lot to be said in Georgia, whether you are the gubernatorial candidate, whether you are the Senate candidate, whether you're running for AG, SOS. Those races are certainly going to be very interesting.
So let's talk about this word microcosm. Right? Is Georgia a bellwether for anything? Is it so goes Georgia as goes Georgia? Like, or is it just a cool, for political nerds, like follow that race and then there are other races? Is it does it mean anything, or is it just kind of cool to be Georgia?
I mean, I do think it's cool to be Georgia, but I think it's an interesting state because of the diversity of the state in so many ways. You have a lot of white rural voters that have traditionally voted Republican. You also have a lot of black rural voters. You also have this urban center and a lot of very educated people, both inside and outside of that urban center. And so it is an interesting place. You have a growing Latino population. You have a big black population. You have white college educated people, white rural people who have not gone to college. And so like the number of dynamics that are playing out in the state are very interesting. It's also a state that, Democrats haven't held the governor's mansion there since, look at you, Mike, if you know the year, I mean, for many years, we'll call it 20 years or more,
20, 30 years,
21,
right?
20, 30 years more. And you're seeing some inroads and some progress on these statewide races. The state ledge and the congressional maps are still very gerrymandered, so it's hard to make progress on that front. But you still are seeing progress being chipped away on that front for the Democrats. So, I do think it's an interesting place. There is no other place like it. No two states are alike. No two districts are exactly alike. But it's a place where I think you can look at any one of these issues and individual communities, and there's a good kind of sample size, if you will, to be able to extrapolate what that might mean in other places.
What do you think? Does that resonate, Mike? So if you're polling in Georgia or you're looking at the primaries, are there lessons that the parties can take from what's going on in Georgia to other states around the country, or is Georgia really different enough that it's really only about Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what a lot of Lucinda says. I mean, the demographics in Georgia have changed quite a bit, right? So looking at those Latino populations there, looking at the black population there, I think you learn a lot about that. Also looking at the, kind of urban politics feel to it too. See how the cities are going. You're seeing Fulton County and the areas around it really growing quite a lot when it comes to population. So, making your inroads in the cities, in the urban areas there, I think are really important for Republicans. Polling those people there, seeing how they're moving, how they're trending. But going back to Georgia too, I think the Senate race is the one thing Republicans feel pretty good about keeping the Senate. But there's a lot of competitive Senate races out there. I mean, North Carolina, you have the former popular governor there, Roy Cooper, who's running a pretty strong campaign if you're looking at the polls compared to Michael Whatley. You're looking at Michigan. That's an open seat right now. Republicans, they may win that seat. Mike Rogers is running there. He ran a good campaign last time, 2 years ago, sorry. And then, I think Democrats, they may have their strongest competitor against Susan Collins, she's seemingly unbeatable. I mean, they throw everything at her, and she always seems to overcome it up in Maine. So I think Georgia, once again, could be one of those seats that really decides the outcome of the Senate at the end of the day. That's the one that I'd be looking at.
So interesting. It sounds like maybe there are lessons from Georgia. Maybe Georgia looks like parts of the rest of the country. It's exciting enough on its own. But you mentioned another important Senate race in Maine. I know, you're tracking the Maine and Texas races in particular. I find Maine especially interesting, just because for such a small state, it has a lot of really high-profile people running for statewide office. Talk about the Maine race.
Yeah, I think that, it's going to be hard to predict what happens in the Maine race until the primaries are over, of course. And Maine, in addition to formerly living in Texas, I was also a former New Englander. And so I think I have some authority to say Maine is weird. Good weird.
So Austin and Maine, both weird. I'm sensing a trend.
I think I'm the common denominator. But anyway, obviously there's been all this uproar around Grim Plattner and his various controversies, big debate in the Democratic side as well about Janet Mills and, whether or not she should be eligible to continue her career in politics, given the fact that she's in her mid-80s. And it seems like at this moment, no one is particularly satisfied. And so my hot take on this is that most likely, if the Democrats are going to win that seat, it's not with either of those candidates. It's with somebody who hasn't risen to prominence yet. I mean, going back to Mamdani, it wasn't a long cycle for him from 1% to being the underdog winner in that primary. And I think we could see something similar take place in Maine, because I think people are looking for a vessel for their frustration. And that's part of why there was so much energy around Plattner that he kind of fumbled. And I don't think Mills is up to that desire. Maybe nobody is. Maybe it's an unrealistic desire because nobody's perfect. And then just play devil's advocate on myself, if Plattner does pull it out and win the Democratic primary in the end, I think it speaks to a really interesting dynamic going forward in terms of perfectionism and to what extent now in 2025, 2026, when the primary is happening, we're holding candidates to the same standard as we have been for the last several decades. I think there's a growing understanding, partially because of Trump and his seemingly Teflon nature on the right, but also partly because of our burgeoning digital culture and how there's an understanding among everybody under 50 and some people over that the stuff that you did online 20 years ago that was stupid is going to outlive you. And we all have things we're not proud of. You can't hide it. You can't create this perfect image. And people are looking for whatever's real underneath that. So if Plattner does win the primary, I think it opens a lot of doors for a lot of interesting candidates and races going forward.
So much to unpack there. I want to find the most boring possible piece of that and unpack it. In particular, I want to look at the governor's race in Maine. Right, the Democratic side, you've got the son of a sitting U.S. senator, the daughter of a sitting member of the House of Representatives, and the current Secretary of State, all of whom are friends, all of whom are running. And on the Republican side, you have a Bush. Right? One of the features of Maine moves away from the persuasion and the good, interesting work that you two do, just to the mechanics of this. Maine has ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. What does that do to your political calculations or your thinking about how these races go?
Ranked choice voting is wild. I just want to say,
explain.
My firm is undefeated at ranked choice voting elections. So I want to think I'm some kind of an expert. I am not. It is very, look, I think polling, I'm not a pollster, but I do think polling is in the middle of an evolution and it is tough to trust polls right now, right? It is tough to poll, I think, in general. So many people are not willing to sit on the phone and take a 20-minute survey talking on the phone, right? So, and that's a different conversation for a different day, but ranked choice voting is even harder. When you have a multi-candidate primary, it is pretty dangerous to go negative inside of that primary, even in a normal election. In a ranked choice voting situation, it is incredibly dangerous because you risk really alienating a lot of people. And in the New York City mayor's race, you saw a very effective, Don't Rank Cuomo campaign that I think was something that was very unique to Cuomo and his baggage and everything that he brought to that, right? But, I think taking shots at people can definitely backfire in a much easier way. So, you really have to think about, if you can't be someone's first choice, can you be their second choice? And, in New York, you're ranking down 5 people, which is asking a lot of people to actually know about 5 candidates running in a primary. However, I do think it presents some really interesting challenges and complications for how each of those candidates has to position themselves to be the front runner, but also kind of how do we bring people together? And what I think it does well is it does set you up to bring a coalition forward as you move into the general election.
So this is, have you worked in ranked choice races? And if so, how does this change how you're approaching the 26th cycle?
Yeah, I haven't, but I will say I don't really have a strong opinion one way or another on ranked choice voting. But in the state of Virginia, going back to Glenn Youngkin, if it wasn't for ranked choice voting there, he wouldn't have been the governor. So, it's helped out candidates like him quite a bit. So I think in that sense, it was a positive example. Going back to the governor's race, though, in Maine, I think it's, interesting on both sides. Like you mentioned, Bush is running. You have Laura Libby, who may step into the race. She's pretty much a conservative firebrand. And then I think one of the more interesting candidates of the cycle on the Republican side is this guy named Owen McCarthy, who's running for governor in in Maine. He's a millennial. He's an entrepreneur, engineer, tech background, really, humble roots. And I think a lot of the stuff that he's talking about is kind of the stuff that generates some buzz with younger voters. He's talking a lot about AI and utilizing that, talking a lot about advanced engineering and kind of making Maine a hub for that, for new jobs in the future. So kind of some of the campaign rhetoric that's coming out of him I think is really interesting. And just in general, I think the gubernatorial race up there is really fascinating on both sides. And it'll be interesting. Like you said, ranked choice voting, this is the first time it's taking place in the gubernatorial primary. So that'll be really interesting to see how that goes.
All right, I want to push back a little bit on something you just said. So you're watching this young millennial candidate talking about tech, but a moment ago we all agreed that affordability was the message in 26.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's talking about, tech's one of the things he's talking about. He's definitely talking about housing. Housing prices have jumped quite a bit there in Maine, become one of the more expensive states to buy a house right now. So he's talking about innovative solutions to that, talking about a number of different topics, but I think it's interesting that he's channeling AI and those kind of issues as a centerpiece of his campaign. It's different, it's unique, something that not a lot of candidates have been doing.
Interesting, interesting. I want to move to another technical, because obviously ranked choice voting changes how you do campaigns, right? Do you go negative? When do you go negative? Do you run to finish second? Like, how do you, it just changes the mechanics of it. One of the things that's changed the mechanics of a lot of how all this works is gerrymandering, right? You've got districts in this country where most of the districts, if you win the primary, you're probably going to win the general. At some point, do the districts determine the makeup of the House and the Senate, and campaigns simply become less relevant? Talk about just the mechanics of the legal constraints around a campaign.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think obviously the Senate is statewide, so we're not gerrymandering in the Senate. However, you know, look, I think in the House, we have so many layers of issues, and I think both a feature and a quirk of the Democratic Party is that we are like believers in good government and really want to have fair maps and fair proposals, and it's spent a lot of time through, there was a group called the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that popped up that really advocated for fair maps across the board. In the places where the legislature is drawing the maps, they also draw their own maps. So like everything is so far gerrymandered that it is really hard to see a path to get back some state legislative chambers inside of the country for Democrats at this moment. And that has in turn had the same effect on maps on the congressional level, right? I am old enough to have lived through Texas Democrats fleeing the state 3 times over like redistricting and what that process looks like and how brutal it is. And, you know, there is a very big importance that we all work together as a party. And I think the Democrats are learning a very hard lesson in terms of free maps right this minute as Donald Trump and Republicans are going into each individual state and advocating and pushing legislatures really hard to pass mid-decade redistricting. Sorry, I need to get all the words right there. Right, so right, it's unprecedented. And it poses a huge problem, and it has really created this moment for Democrats to really look at ourselves in the mirror and say, like, are we going to play to win? What are we doing here? So you saw Texas, in what was already an incredibly gerrymandered state, go a step further. And I think the Supreme Court will uphold those maps. Ultimately, they have approximately 6 days to figure that out before the filing deadline. And then you saw the Gavin Newsom and Democrats in California put an initiative on the ballot to adopt new maps temporarily until basically the Trump administration is over. The way they drew those maps is kind of interesting, and I could talk about that all day, but I won't bore you. But, you know, it really has created what is now kind of a more even playing field by being able to kind of bank a few seats in California, despite what Republicans are doing in Texas right now. So I will slow down because I know I could do this all day.
No, I'm with you. I've worked in redistricting reform over the years when I was a consultant. Fascinating stuff, actually, weirdly fascinating.
Yeah.
A member of our faculty thinks that our students should take GIS courses in part to understand things like redistricting, which is super cool. Does that mean, though, the Democrats should, earlier you said the Democrats should expand the map. You know, the race happening tonight might be an example of why we do that, but are there limits to that expansion? Should we just say, you know what, this one's too far gone?
Sorry, are you talking about like in Democratic?
In like, are the Republican districts that it's not worth competing in because, or if you're a Republican, there are Democratic districts it's not worth competing in, just because the margins are so wide. There's so many more D's or R's that are just unwinnable. Yeah, no, I think there are districts that are not on the map. There are 435 districts in Congress right now. We have to get to 218. There are approximately, when I started working on the House map many moons ago, I'm not going to put a date on it, right, there were approximately 80 to 100 House seats on the map that we would actively compete for with the NRCC. And at this point, that has dwindled down to about 50 to 60. And that is a huge shift. And you were also seeing that play out in the types of people who are getting elected into Congress and the division that is being sown. The Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, who is so divisive,
she's obviously leaving, and that has a different conversation as well. But there are these very far right members of the Congress, and there are very far left members of Congress, and it does make governing really hard. The kind of Don Bacons of the world and, the kind of more moderate, if you will, folks of the world are a kind of dying breed in Congress. And those folks in those kind of middle of the road seats where you have to talk to both Republicans and Democrats to win them, that is how legislating gets done. That is how laws get made. So, like, how do we move forward as a country with all of this? And it's a problem for our democracy, honestly.
So I want to talk about, Mike, I want to ask you about where governance working. You and I've talked about this a little bit. I'm in the tank for mayors. I'm a huge fan of mayors. I love that you work with mayors. Mayors don't put up with redistricting. Like they're like, you've got your city and that's your thing. What's it like working with mayors? Is it different than working with a more partisan or with member of the House?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think the interesting thing about mayors is in about 40 to 50% of all mayoral races in the country, they run as nonpartisans. So you don't know if they're a Republican or a Democrat. They're really focused on those issues that matter on the ground, picking up your trash, fixing the potholes. One thing that I mentioned to you earlier, too, is, I mean, I think a lot of people, the majority of people, they may not know their state representative. Hell, they may not even know their congressman, but they'll know their mayor. Their mayor's the person at the Little League games. He's at the, business openings. He's all over the place. So, and I think having that personal relationship, in a sense, in a lot of these cities with these mayors, really goes a long way. I take a look at a couple elections that happened early this year in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There was an incumbent Democrat there. Baton Rouge, predominantly African-American city, a city that Kamala Harris won overwhelmingly, but I think like 20 to 30 points. With the Republican Mayors Association, we got involved with a race there where a former football coach who was really on the ground, he got to know the community, he ran for mayor, made it to the runoff, we backed him, he wound up unseating this Democratic mayor. So it goes to show that on local politics, I don't think that R or that D matters as much. It's if you're visible, if you're answering the constituents' questions and their calls. I think that's what matters more than anything. And I think, you're seeing a lot in Congress right now. I think there's 38 former mayors, right? And a lot of these people, they have that experience of working both sides of the aisle. So more mayors in Congress, I think you get more things done because they have to put aside their partisanship and, get that zoning done for the city, get their budget in line, things along those lines, and work with everybody. So yeah, it's really interesting to work with mayors. A lot of good work to do for the Republican mayors in these upcoming years. It's something that hasn't been, the RMA started about 2 years ago. There's been a Democratic Mayors Association for about 30 years. So a lot of catch up, but making our way there. So it's been fun.
Are there mayor's races we should be watching?
Yeah, actually next week we have one in Miami. That's a huge one. So the current mayor, Suarez, he's been in there for I think 2 terms right now. It's been a Republican city for I want to say about the last 12 years or so. Democrats got behind one candidate, Eileen Higgins, a while ago. That's another primary where it's nonpartisan, so the top 2 advance. A Republican, Emilio Gonzalez, emerged from there. He's a business background, government background. Donald Trump's endorsed him. Ron DeSantis has endorsed him. So it'll be interesting. Miami-Dade County, Trump won that by 10. He lost Miami by 1 point. So we'll see kind of what happens this year with that trend there. But definitely an interesting race.
So, Chloe, I know you're really interested in communities and how communities work together. And it sounds like mayors are they're the political focal point of a community.
Yeah. I was thinking about, when you were talking about how mayors show up everywhere, I was thinking about my borough president growing up in Brooklyn, Marty Markowitz. He was everywhere. Before the days of Eric Adams, we had Marty Markowitz.
It was at my church in Brooklyn. I remember seeing it there, yeah. Not going to lie.
Yeah. But anyway, I think this same idea, while there are structural reasons why it's easier for mayors to fill that role, I do think it can be applied pretty much anywhere. And I was going to mention this in response to what Lucinda was saying about expanding the map and where we can and can't run. The whole abundance discourse is not relevant to this conversation, so I'm not going to wade into it, except to say that in the conclusion of abundance, Klein Thompson write about how the idea of political orders being periods in American history where the question of politics is divided along a certain question, along a certain axis. And they argue that that axis is shifting and has been shifting since 2016 and isn't done shifting yet. And I agree with that very strongly. So even though we still have the affective polarization that causes people to adhere so strongly to the red and blue mentality, I do think that there's room to push at that and see what the limits are. And I'm most of the year, I like to pretend that I'm not from New York. But around the New York City mayoral election, I think I can invoke it just a little bit. And one of the points that I've made a couple times in class is that there's this idea of like, oh, Mamdani could only win in New York because it's this hyper-progressive city, and of course you can run a socialist there. Well, let's remember, first of all, Eric Adams, very close relationship with Trump. Before that, de Blasio, kind of middle of the road. Before that, Bloomberg. Before that, Giuliani. So it's not like New York is some haven of the most progressive politics as a city as a whole, and in part, that is because of the outer boroughs, which function much more like some of the suburban parts of New York. Like there's parts of Queens where you would easily think that you're in Long Island, right? So I think the fact that Mamdani was able to succeed there just speaks to the fact that we don't know what any of these places really stand for. And what people are looking for may not be a specific set of policies. It may not be a specific party affiliation. It may be a personal connection. And I think we don't know yet the extent to which that's true, which is why 2026 is so exciting, because we have the opportunity to test it.
What do you think, Lucinda?
Yeah, I'm listening to Chloe talk, and I'm just thinking about, we were talking earlier in the green room about the Texas Senate primary, and you have Colin Allred, who spent $100 million. It's a hard state to do business in, and has been the nominee, has really good name ID, is a really interesting guy. He's a former football player, decided to get involved as a reaction to the Trump election in 2017. The same time, this state senator, James Tallarico, decided to run for his seat in the state legislature. And you see, both with Graham Plattner, with Mamdani, with Tallarico, these are three very different people that I would venture to say probably agree with more than what they don't, but they are very different, and I don't think that you can really lump them together kind of ideologically. However, they're speaking to something out there right now. I mean, Tallarico is, training to be a Presbyterian minister, and he talks about being this progressive populist through the lens of his faith. And it is speaking to Democrats in the state in a really big way right now that is very interesting. So, I don't know what happens in the Maine Senate primary. I don't know what happens in the Texas Senate primary, but there is something happening out there, and we do need to pay attention to it.
And if I can just respond to that really, it reminds me of what you were saying about McCarthy, too, in Maine, that maybe the common thread between all of these different candidates is just that they're different. Yeah. That everybody hates what's going on, and so if you can give people an option to do something different, it almost doesn't matter what that is.
And on that point, too, I mean, we all listen to politicians speak. I mean, a lot of the times they're saying the same talking points over and over.
Yeah.
So when somebody says something different, it draws your attention. They're that new shiny object that you want to reach out and, get to know a little bit better.
And it draws more eyes.
Right.
Yeah.
That all makes sense. All makes sense. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to go to the audience for questions or thoughts. And if you don't have any, I certainly have more questions. But Professor says no. I'm a little intimidated being interviewed by... You've asked them questions?
No, it's a tremendous conversation. Really appreciate your points. And I want to come to the affordability, back to the affordability thing. Because what you didn't talk about was Donald Trump's comments about affordability today, where he called it a con job and said, essentially, the administration has gotten prices down and minimized what Americans are feeling because this has been, I think, according to him, or what he was trying to lay out there, so successful. So, A, is he right? Because then he's correcting himself from not long ago when affordability was a problem. Or B, is he making a huge mistake here because he's going to be discordant with what people experience when they go to the grocery store or anywhere else, and they're still feeling that inflation hangover from 2020 and prices are up 20 and 25% overall. It takes a while to get used to this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think prices have been going up since COVID, right? You're never going to get back to those pre-COVID prices with a lot of things. Progress has been made on a lot of things. I think, like I said, with gas prices, they're low since 21. You're still feeling it at the grocery store, I think, with a number of different issues, different items that you're buying. Some items are going down, some aren't. I think, we'll see what happens with the tariffs once they're fully in within the system. We'll see what happens with the big beautiful bill once that gets into play. See if prices go down with that. But I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it's going to take time with anything. With Biden had 4 years of prices going up. You had prices going up towards the last 2 years of Trump's time in office. It happens. It's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. So I think take minimal steps in the right direction.
So it's okay for him to call it a con job, politically?
I mean, I think he's right when saying that certain things are going down. So I mean,
And he says it's just the Democrats' issue, and it's
a Republican issue too. I mean, I think Republicans.
but he's hanging on the Dems.
I don't necessarily think it's a con job. I mean, look, I think like I said, it's going to take time. Democrats are going to criticize it. That's going to be one of the things they're going to go after because he said we'll get it fixed overnight. Nothing's going to happen overnight, right? That's what he said during the campaign. We'll get this fixed right away, right? It's never going to happen. Nothing's ever going to happen right away. You got to be realistic about that.
So if I could, does the affordability issue have a shelf life? And actually, by the time we come around to the midterms, either people have gotten used to it, prices have got calmed down, and whether it's a con job or otherwise, it just doesn't have the salience that it seemed to have this last election.
No, it will still have salience. And look, I think Donald Trump should look at recent history and look at, frankly, the economic tour that Biden went on, right? He did a full months-long tour trying to tell people, like, look, unemployment's down. Look, we're doing good stuff, guys. We're trying. Like, he went out there, and it didn't work. It didn't work. It actually backfired in a really bad way because then he's gone around branding the Biden economy that Republicans were able to use against him incredibly effectively. I think history will show that Biden did take very good steps, and his presidency, I think, will be reflected in a very positive light. But in that moment, when people are showing up to pay for their groceries, that is all they can think about. And by calling it a con job and by not meeting people where they are and saying, like, I feel your pain and we got to figure this out, guys, and then actually presenting policy ideas with which to do so. And instead, right, what he is doing is, adding tariffs that are driving up prices. That has been very much reported on. You have the healthcare costs that are going to continue to go up, and you just see him now trying to say that it's not real, and people know it's real. People feel it every day.
So I want to unpack this a little bit, because on one hand, we've been talking about the shiny new thing. Somebody's talking about something. They're not using the traditional talking points. On the other hand, it's the lived experience, affordability, right? People don't live the macro economy. They buy gas and groceries. Those cost a lot. On the other hand, we kind of want politicians who we can relate to, right? So you've got to have a good story, a good storyteller, and that story has to meet the facts at some level. How do you do that? Right? What do you think, Chloe? How do you make all those things work together?
Well, I think the Democratic executives who won in November did those three things very effectively. I mean, Mikey Sherrill, she got less press than the other two, but she is, a Jersey girl down to the wire. And talking about we're going to freeze utility payments, it's an in-the-weeds issue that speaks to affordability, speaks to the experience that people are dealing with every day. So even though it's in the weeds and feels like concrete and real, it's very legible to people. It's easy to explain. It speaks to affordability while also being different. So I think that's an example of how you can do all of these things at the same time. And just back to Professor Chisnow's original question really quickly, I think that it's a mistake for Trump to say that everything is fine, for exactly the reasons that Lucinda pointed to. And I think it's a missed opportunity to instead say we are making things better, which I personally still don't think is true, but at least it's harder to disprove. We just had Black Friday, and yes, in total gross spending, Americans spent more than last year, but they bought, I think it's 2 or 3% less items, fewer items. And so, especially going into the biggest spending season of the year from a consumer perspective, people understand that the economy is not as good as he says it is, but maybe they would believe him if he said he was working on it.
But will this matter? I mean, if time matters, then we're acting as if, if the election were tomorrow, it would be different than it would be a year from now. Does the economy have to catch up with the story?
I think it will. I mean, like I said,
And what if it doesn't? If it doesn't, you're kind of betting, the Republicans are kind of betting on this economy and the compelling story, as Biden did.
Right.
The story and people's lived reality didn't match.
If it doesn't, I think with a lot of races, you're going to see them really honing in on certain local issues. I think it's going to go back to that. I mean, when you look at the congressional races, for instance, right, since Trump's been on the ballot in 2016, right, Republicans haven't performed as well if he's not on the ballot, right? So there's this, when it comes to congressional races, I think as Republicans, we're going to have to look at these low propensity Trump voters and see what moves them, right? Really invest in data, take a look at that, analyze those data, and hone in those few issues that really get them out to vote for Trump. Run on some of those. You don't have to make it a national election. Find those couple issues, run on those, and run on those local issues within your district.
Interesting, interesting. I think we have time for a couple more questions, thoughts? Please.
So I live in a state that federally voted for Harris, and our whole federal delegation is Democratic, but our governor, executive council, and both chambers of the state legislature are red.
What state?
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire.
In 2026, we have a Senate race and a House race. We have in the Senate primaries for both parties, and in the House, at least a Democratic primary. With the split in the state and the primaries, and our primaries are in September, which is really close to the general. How do you go about running that race? Both as a Republican trying to pick up seats and as a Democrat trying to retain seats in a state that is so split between federal and state in terms of party.
That's a great question.
Yeah, and New Hampshire is fascinating and so tough. I think there's a lot of folks that want to just put New Hampshire in the Democratic category because of the Senate delegation and then just call it good, but that's actually not reality at all, right? I think New Hampshire in specific is a very tax-sensitive state and a very economic-sensitive state. It is also a state that is very sensitive to, like the live free or die, the libertarian streak that lives in New Hampshire is so important. And the abortion issue there, I actually think is very important to continue to communicate on. It is an issue it is a state where we were talking about abortion long before we were talking about it in the rest of the country, and where folks really feel there, like, you gotta let people, make their decisions about their own bodies, and and so I think that will also be a factor that you have to poll, you have to test, but you have to communicate on in a state like New Hampshire. It can't be, there's no such thing as a one size fits all campaign. And I think just to tie this back kind of to the conversation we're having about like the Tallaricos and the Plattners of the world, like there has to be an emotional connection. You have to be able to make an emotional connection with people. So if you're telling people you're a con person or these talking points are a con, right, you're not going to be able to make that like connective tissue. And I think that presents some interesting challenges for Republicans all across the country who like can't really buck the president because there's so much, like he has so much kind of such a grip on Republicans across the country, and also really try to make that connective tissue with people to be like, I feel your pain, right? That's going to be really tough, I think, for some people to try to thread that needle.
So as a Democrat, you talk about affordability, abortion, and just make a human connection. Yeah,
I think it's really important to like tell a story that shows that you are really able to understand people and listen to people. And that piece where I think that's kind of what the Plattners and the Tallaricos of the world are kind of tapping into.
So on the Republican side?
I think you have a Sununu on the ballot, which I think is interesting. That name in the state of New Hampshire has been, historically gold. So we'll see how that works out. He's running actually against Scott Brown in the primary, which is interesting. But yeah, no, I mean, I think like Lucinda said, there's that big libertarian streak in New Hampshire. Connecting with voters is a huge thing. I know Chris Sununu did an excellent job at that. He was out and about over the state. But yeah, no, definitely interesting. The Pappas race, as he's running for Senate. I mean, a lot of well-funded candidates will be there. A ton of money will come into New Hampshire. I think Kelly Ayotte's victory, she ran ahead of Trump. That was telling. Steal some of her playbook for these races will be important for Republicans as well.
So what story are you telling? So on the Democratic side, abortion, affordability, human connection. What's the Republican theory of the case?
I mean, I think it's going to be affordability again. I think it's going to be, regulation, I think, is another issue there. Fighting against, there's no sales tax in the state of New Hampshire. There's no state income tax. Fighting against those, making those issues prominent within the state, and, keeping costs down and affordable. Yeah.
And again, the human connection.
Yeah.
So the last piece on the human connection, I know we're out of time, but one of the things I've been telling the press is this: I would not want to be an incumbent in 2026, and I might not want to be a legacy candidate. But Sununu might be the difference here because his family's so well liked.
It could be, yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think Chris Sununu, if he ran, I think he wins that no problem. John Sununu's been out of office for a little while. The name still lingers, you know. I think Chris will be active on the campaign trail. See how that goes.
All right, all right. Last thoughts on New Hampshire?
Well, I mean, just to your point about legacy candidates, I think that it's a question of what do you represent? And the assumption underlying that idea is that legacy candidates represent adherence to the system. But that's not always the case. There is room for people to use a contrast with their family, I mean, Schlossberg in New York, right, as a way of communicating divergence or a new idea in a shorthand. So we'll have to see.
Interesting, interesting. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Campaigns and Elections. It's been a great fall. I've learned a ton, and we'll see you next time.